The morning broke quietly over the restless city of Lagos. A faint golden glow spread across cracked rooftops, uneven pavements, and streets already alive with honking danfos and hurried footsteps. Beneath one of the many worn-out bridges, life began for Adana much the same way it had for countless days before. She clutched a battered basket, the wooden handle cutting into her small palms as she carried what little bread she had managed to gather. Her steps were careful, her face determined, yet her frail frame betrayed the exhaustion of a child who had long carried burdens beyond her years. Her world was one of constant survival. Every loaf of bread was more than food. It was medicine for her sick mother. It was rent for the small corner of space they called home. It was proof that she could keep despair at bay for just one more day. She had learned early that life did not pause for weakness. The streets demanded resilience, and the city's chaos offered no compassion. Each sunrise carried the same question. How much strength did she still have left to keep fighting? As she walked beneath the bridge, dust rising with each step, she pressed the basket tighter against her chest. Her mother's coughing echoed. In her mind, sharp and unrelenting, a reminder that time was slipping away. For Adana, there was no childhood. Only responsibility, hunger, and the gnawing fear that her mother might not see another dawn. Her tired brown eyes, however, carried something unbreakable. Behind the fatigue was a quiet fire, a stubborn refusal to surrender. Then, the rhythm of her mourning broke. A sudden gleam of polished steel cut across the dusty ground. From the far end of the bridge, a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom emerged, its presence so out of place it felt unreal. The car moved slowly, its mirror-like surface reflecting the colors of Lagos in distorted fragments. The ochre dust, the flashing Kiki headlights, the deep shadows under the bridge. It was as if two worlds had collided, poverty rooted in survival, and wealth moving with silent power. The vehicle's doors opened with elegance, and from within stepped a tall black man dressed in a navy suit so immaculate it seemed untouched by the world outside. His polished shoes sank slightly into the dirt, a poetic contrast to the broken concrete beneath his feet. His dark skin glowed under the sunlight, his presence commanding without a word. Whispers rippled through the crowd that had gathered. Faces of black men, women, and children framed in awe, suspicion, and curiosity. The city seemed to hold its breath. Adana froze. Her small body stiffened as the man's gaze fell on her, not with disdain, but with a strange intensity she could not understand. She hugged the basket tighter, suspicion cutting through her exhaustion. Why had such a man, a stranger of wealth and power, chosen to step into her forgotten corner of the city? For a brief moment, the dusty underpass of Lagos turned into a stage, and everyone present became part of a scene they would retell for years. The wealthy stranger, a man whose presence radiated both authority and gentleness, stepped fully into the chaos of the bridge. His polished car stood behind him like a silent monument of wealth, while the crowd around buzzed with confusion. Mothers, with headscarves, adjusted their children's positions to get a clearer look. Men leaned on rusty motorbikes, whispering predictions, and street vendors temporarily abandoned their stalls, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. Adana, clutching her basket with trembling fingers, watched him closely. His suit, cut to perfection, glistened faintly in the morning sun, and yet his eyes held something softer than the steel of business. They were the eyes of a man who had seen wealth, power, and glory, but also knew pain. He extended his hand, slightly, a gesture not of dominance, but of offering, and with it came an unexpected silence that hushed the murmurs of the crowd. From the inner pocket of his coat, he drew out a small velvet box. The sudden sparkle of the diamond within it seemed almost unreal against the backdrop of rusted iron beams and cracked concrete. Gasps rippled through the gathering, disbelief, awe, and suspicion colliding at once. The crowd leaned closer, their dark faces illuminated by sunlight bouncing off the gem. It was a jewel out of place, a beacon of a life far removed from their own struggles. Adana's chest tightened, fear mixed with anger in her eyes. To her, this was no gift, no miracle. It was a question she didn't want asked, a promise she dared not believe in. Why me? Her gaze seemed to demand. Why would a man wrapped in wealth's embrace step into her story, her poverty, her fragile world of bread and medicine? Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze shifting to the shadowed corner where her mother lay. The old woman, her body frail and bones pressing against thin skin, rested on a piece of worn cardboard. Every breath was a battle, every cough an echo of years of hardship. She was the reason Adana carried bread, the reason she endured stares, whispers, and hunger. The stranger followed Adana's gaze. His expression shifted, the firmness of a businessman melting into something deeply human. He saw not just a girl resisting his offering, but a story of sacrifice carved into her young shoulders. He stepped forward, closing the gap between privilege and poverty, his polished shoes raising small clouds of dust. The crowd leaned in further, holding their breath, their collective eyes moving between the girl, the frail mother, and the man who had stepped into their world. The air thickened with anticipation, as if the city itself waited to see what path destiny would choose. The underpass had grown strangely quiet. Even the usual sounds of Lagos traffic, the blaring horns, shouting vendors, and rattling keke engines, seemed to fade into the distance. All that remained was the fragile thread connecting three souls: Adana, her dying mother, and the man whose presence carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. The stranger's eyes softened as they lingered on the frail woman lying on the torn cardboard. He had seen boardrooms glitter with chandeliers. He had stood in halls where his name commanded power, yet nothing had shaken him as much as the sight of a woman whose entire life had been reduced to shallow breaths beneath a forgotten bridge. Her face, carved with wrinkles of struggle, spoke of battles fought long before he arrived. Adana crouched down beside her mother, gently adjusting the cloth that served as her pillow. The basket of bread slipped to the ground, forgotten. She held her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers barely covering the paper-thin skin. "Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please, just hold on." The stranger knelt. Beside them, his tailored suit brushing against the dust. In that moment, there was no distance between them, no difference of class, wealth, or status. He was simply a man confronted with the raw, unfiltered truth of human suffering. His voice was calm, steady, yet urgent. "She needs help. Now." The crowd murmured again, their voices like a tide rising and falling. Some whispered that perhaps this was a miracle. Others doubted, claiming no rich man would lower himself for the poor. But the stranger ignored them. He reached for his phone and barked quick orders. Within minutes, the quiet hum of an approaching ambulance broke through the air, its siren faint but growing louder. Adana's eyes widened. Her chest heaved as hope, something she had long buried, flickered to life. She looked at the stranger, disbelief clouding her face. Who was this man who could summon help so swiftly, who could change the course of their lives in a matter of moments? When the ambulance arrived, medics in crisp uniforms rushed forward, carrying a stretcher. The crowd parted, whispers trailing after them. They lifted the old woman gently, though every movement drew a soft groan of pain from her fragile body. Adana clung to her mother's side, her little feet stumbling to keep up, fear and desperation tangled in her heart. The stranger followed closely, his tall figure a steady shadow beside them. For Adana, the moment was dizzying, as if the bridge she had known all her life had suddenly transformed into a doorway, leading her from despair into something unknown. She could not yet call it hope, but it felt like a possibility she had never dared to dream of. As the ambulance doors closed, Adana's tear-streaked face pressed against the window, her eyes meeting the stranger's one more time. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest whisper of destiny moving through her life. The ambulance raced through the bustling streets of Lagos, its siren slicing through the morning chaos. Inside, Adana clung to her mother's hand, her small frame trembling with fear. Every bump in the road made her mother groan. Every gasp of breath tightened Adana's chest further. She had lived all her life fighting for bread, for medicine, for one more day. Yet never had she been this close to losing it all. The stranger sat opposite them, his tall frame bent slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the old woman. His suit, so sharp and clean, looked almost out of place in the cramped space of the ambulance. Yet his presence brought with it a sense of stability, as though he were anchoring Adana against the storm threatening to pull her under. He did not speak much, but when his eyes met Adana's, she saw something unfamiliar. Concern, not pity. Strength, not judgment. At the hospital gates, the medics rushed her mother inside. Adana tried to follow, but a nurse held her back, insisting she wait outside the emergency doors. Her chest heaved with panic. Her world had always been fragile, but now it felt like it was breaking apart entirely. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching as doctors surrounded her mother. Every second stretched endlessly, each passing moment a thread of hope fraying further. The stranger stood beside her, silent. He could have left. Men of wealth often did, sweeping through lives like passing storms. But he remained. His gaze never wavered from the small girl trembling before him. Finally he spoke, his voice low but firm. "She is stronger than you think. Do not lose faith." Adana turned to him, eyes red with tears. "Faith doesn't buy medicine. Faith doesn't stop hunger." Her words cut through the air, sharp with the honesty of someone who had known only struggle. For a moment the stranger said nothing, absorbing the weight of her truth. Then he knelt, so his eyes were level with hers. But sometimes faith brings people together who were never meant to meet. That is what changes everything. Hours passed. The hospital air smelled of antiseptic, and the hallway buzzed with footsteps and murmured conversations. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression softening as he removed his mask. "She will live," he said simply. Relief crashed over Adana like a tidal wave. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if not for the stranger's steady hand catching her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her sobs echoing softly against the sterile walls. For the first time in years, they were tears of hope, not despair. The stranger guided her to a seat, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. In that moment, a fragile bridge formed between two lives that had seemed worlds apart, one built from wealth and power, the other carved from struggle and survival. The hospital room was dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of machines filling the silence. Adana's mother lay on the narrow bed, her chest rising and falling with newfound steadiness. For the first time in weeks, her breathing no longer sounded like a war drum of suffering. She was alive, fragile, but alive. Adana sat at her bedside, holding her mother's frail hand. She studied her mother's face, memorizing every wrinkle, every tired line etched by years of hardship. She had feared losing this face forever beneath the bridge. Yet now it lay before her, bathed in the faint glow of hope. Adana whispered softly, her voice trembling, "Mama, you're safe now." The stranger stood by the doorway, his tall silhouette outlined by the sterile hospital light. He had not left since they arrived, his presence steady and quiet. He could have been elsewhere, in meetings, in luxury, in the rhythm of his privileged life. Yet here he remained, watching over a girl and her mother whom the world had long forgotten. When Adana finally looked up at him, her eyes still, wet with tears, she whispered words almost too soft to hear. "Thank you." They carried more weight than riches, more depth than jewels. They were words spoken from the rawest part of her soul, a gratitude that transcended language. The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable yet gentle. "No child should bear the weight you carry," he said, his voice low. "You deserve to be seen, not just survive." His words struck Adana in a place she had buried deep, a place where dreams once lived before hunger had stolen them away. For the first time, someone was not just helping her survive the day, but reminding her she was worthy of more. Her mother stirred, her tired eyes opening slightly. They searched the room before settling on the stranger. A faint smile tugged at her lips, though it was lined with exhaustion. With what little strength she had, she whispered, "God sends angels in many forms." The man bowed his head slightly, humbled by her words. He did not see himself as an angel, only as a man who could not ignore suffering when it stood before him. Yet in that moment, surrounded by silence and fragile breaths, he realized something deeper. This encounter was not coincidence. It was a crossing of paths written long before the day began. As the night wore on, Adana remained by her mother's side, her small figure illuminated by the pale hospital light. The stranger eventually stepped out into the hallway, but his thoughts stayed rooted in the room he had just left. He had entered their story by chance, but now it tugged at him with a force he could not resist. Something had begun beneath that bridge. Something larger than bread, poverty, or diamonds. A new thread of destiny was weaving itself quietly into all their lives. Dawn crept slowly across the Lagos skyline, painting the hospital walls in hues of gold and pale pink. The city outside roared with its usual chaos, blaring horns, shouts of vendors, the restless rhythm of life. Yet inside, the quiet hospital room, time felt still, as though the world had paused for the fragile lives gathered there. Adana had barely slept. She remained curled in a chair by her mother's bedside, her small hand resting protectively over her mother's. Her eyelids drooped with exhaustion, but she would not let herself drift fully into sleep. Fear had taught her vigilance. Dreams had always been luxuries she could not afford. The door creaked open softly, and the stranger entered. He carried no entourage, no sign of wealth, just a small bag of fresh food and bottled water. Placing it gently on the table, he looked at Adana with a calmness that carried both authority and kindness. "You need strength," he said simply. "Your mother needs you strong." Adana hesitated, her pride wrestling with her hunger. For so long she had learned to accept nothing, to expect nothing, for nothing ever came without a cost. But the sincerity in his voice disarmed her. Slowly, she reached for the food, her hands trembling as though she were afraid it might vanish like a dream. The man sat across from her, his gaze never wavering. "I see a fighter in you," he said softly. "The way you stand guard over her, the way you endure. You remind me of someone I once knew." His tone carried the weight of memory, a story untold but heavy in his chest. Adana glanced up, her dark eyes curious but cautious. Why are you helping us?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. The man paused, searching for the right words. Finally he spoke. "Because once, I too knew hunger. Once, I too watched someone I loved struggle to breathe. I swore if I ever had the power, I would never walk past suffering again." His confession stunned her. She had imagined him born into palaces, carried by gold and privilege. Yet here he was, admitting that beneath his polished exterior lived a past carved by pain not so different from her own. For the first time, Adana saw not just a stranger, but a mirror of what survival could become if hope endured. Her small voice trembled as she whispered, "Then, promise me you won't leave us." The man leaned forward, his eyes steady, his hand gently resting over hers. "I do not make promises lightly, but this I swear. Your story will not end in shadows, not while I still breathe." Adana held his gaze, the fragile trust between them deepening like roots anchoring into the earth. It was more than words. It was a vow that would shape the course of their lives, binding two worlds together in a destiny neither had foreseen. The days that followed blended into one another, each marked by the slow healing of Adana's mother and the quiet presence of the stranger who refused to leave their side. The hospital walls became a temporary world, a fragile cocoon where suffering and hope existed side by side. Yet beneath the surface, both Adana and the man carried shadows that refused to be silenced. One evening, as the sky outside bled into shades of purple and crimson, Adana sat by the window staring at the city lights, flickering like distant stars. The stranger joined her, his footsteps soft against the sterile floor. For a long while, they sat in silence, the unspoken filling the space between them. Finally, Adana broke the quiet. "Do you ever forget?" she asked, her small voice almost swallowed by the hum of machines. The man turned his gaze toward her, his eyes reflecting a heaviness that belonged to years long past. "No," he admitted. "Some wounds never leave. They shape you, even when you think you've buried them." Adana's brow furrowed. "I thought rich people don't have wounds." A faint smile tugged at the man's lips, not of joy but of irony. "Wealth hides scars, but it does not erase them." He paused, his jaw tightening as if debating whether to reveal more. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "I grew up in a place not so different from where you live now. Hunger was my first teacher, loss my second. Everything I have now was built on pain I swore I would never let define me." Adana studied him, her young mind struggling to reconcile the image of the man in a sleek suit with the boy he described. For the first time she understood. Wealth was not always born. Sometimes it was carved from the same darkness she knew. She lowered her gaze. "I don't want to forget either. If I forget, then Mama's suffering means nothing. My pain means nothing." The man reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "To remember is not weakness, but do not let memory chain you. Let it guide you, not bind you." His words fell like water over stone, shaping something deep within her. For a moment, Adana felt the weight of her past pressing against the fragile hope of her future. Could a child of shadows really walk into light? Could someone born beneath bridges ever belong in a world of glass towers and shining cars? The man seemed to read her thoughts, his gaze steady as he added, "You are more than where you come from. The world will try to tell you otherwise, but don't listen. I didn't, and neither should you." The room grew quiet again, but this silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of unspoken promises, of shared scars that no longer divided, but connected them. In that moment, Adana realized the stranger's presence was not just a gift. It was a reminder. The past may shape you, but it does not have to define where you end. The morning came softly, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and the hum of a city waking to another day. In the small hospital room, the air felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of suffering and replaced it with a fragile promise of hope. Adana's mother sat propped against her pillows, her breathing steadier, her color slowly returning. She was still weak, but life had returned to her eyes, and with it, a quiet strength. She watched her daughter with pride, marveling at the girl who had carried burdens no child should ever know. Adana, seated beside her mother, clutched her hand, with a gentleness that belied the storm she had weathered. She glanced toward the stranger who stood by the doorway once again, a figure who had become less of a visitor and more of a guardian. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe their story would not always be written in hunger and despair. The man stepped forward, his voice calm yet resolute. "Your journey does not end here," he said, his eyes shifting between mother and daughter. What began beneath the bridge was not an accident. It was the start of something greater. You both deserve more than survival. You deserve a chance. To live! Adana's mother lowered her gaze, humility softening her features. We have nothing to give you, she whispered, her voice frail but sincere. The man shook his head. You've already given me more than wealth could buy. A reminder of why I cannot turn away. You've reminded me of myself, of a boy who once dreamed of escaping the shadows. Tears welled in Adana's eyes, not of sorrow but of something unfamiliar, hope. For the first time she saw a future beyond begging on streets, beyond bridges stained with dust and despair. She saw possibility, fragile yet real, unfolding before her. The stranger placed a hand on Adana's shoulder, his touch steady and grounding. I will not walk away from your story. Whatever paths open from here, know this. You are not invisible anymore. Your life has meaning, and the world will one day see it. The words struck deep within Adana, planting seeds of belief where once only survival had lived. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time she felt tomorrow could be hers to claim. Outside the window, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden beams across the room. It was as though the heavens themselves were blessing this new beginning, washing away the shadows of yesterday. Adana tightened her grip on her mother's hand, her heart whispering the promise her lips could not yet speak. We will rise from this together. And in the quiet of that morning, 3 lives, a mother, a daughter, and a man bound by destiny, stepped into a story no longer defined by sorrow, but by the light of new beginnings.